equations اللي كتبناهم in terms of x. From now on, أكيد it's very important that you know. Hold on. It's very important that you know how to calculate the remaining species in a reaction, but it's also important to know the derivation with x. مش derivation, the rule itself with x, because it makes things faster for you. Okay, so let's start with titration. Titration is very simple. Titration is basically you have an unknown, whether that unknown is an acid or a base, and you need to find the value of the unknown, the concentration of the unknown, mass, number of mole. During that, you also know how to separate the titration curve. So we already did the weak acid. Okay, let's do the weak base and H3. For example, we titrate 10 milliliters of ammoniac solution, which is NH3. Always look at your given. You're given بقولكم إنه هيدا is a weak base. pKa. I know that NH4 plus is the acid, so NH3 is the base, so I'm titrating a weak base. It has an unknown concentration and it is being titrated by a standard hydrochloric acid solution. Basically, this is H3O plus. Now, you always need the concentration of H3O plus to find the unknown. The equivalence point is obtained upon adding V equivalence equals to 10 ml. Note that X is V of the acid added divided by the V equivalence is the degree of progression. Now, if we stop on, what information can we get from this paragraph? You already know that you can find, let's say, the values. You can find all your values from the titration mechanism. بعدكم انتم مذكرين انه number of mole of the acid added during titration at the equivalence point is equal to the number of mole of base added at the equivalence point. Remember this, because the equivalence point is the point when the acid has neutralized completely the base, or the base has completely neutralized the acid. So basically, it's concentration of the acid times V of the acid equals to the concentration of the base times V of the base. If your base is unknown, then your acid is the known, so this is the V equivalence now. And this is your titrant. You can find the volume at equivalence, provided أكيد if you have a concentration, a CB, VB. Or if they gave you the equivalence, مثل هون. So if you look, we have the volume at equivalence given. We have the concentration, no, we have the volume of the base. We have the concentration of the acid. We can find the concentration of the base at equivalence. So remember, any missing information that you have, you can find it through this. هلا خلينا نكفي بالسؤال. The first thing is write the titration reaction. It's very easy. Titration reaction, you have the base NH3, and it is being titrated by H3O plus, which is HCl, in a unique and complete reaction to give you the conjugate acid of NH3 اللي هو NH4 plus H2O. Part B. Calculate the unknown concentration of NH3 denoted by CB. هيا. CB is equal to Ca V equivalence divided by VB, which is equal. Ca is basically 0.1. V equivalence of A is 10 ml divided by the volume of the base is also 10 ml. Why didn't I change it into liters? Because simply ml with ml will cancel. You get 0.1 mole per liter for the base. Good. Calculate the pH for VA equals 0, for VA equals 5, for VA equals 10, for VA equals 20. Now, when you look at these numbers, the normal numbers, you have to find the remaining species and find the pH through the remaining species, or you can simply look at X. There are a few values that is very easy to find. What's the first value that is the easiest to find? Yalla, you can participate through the chat. What's the easiest value to find in this question? Bravo, 0.5. Why 0.5? Because when X equals 0.5, it means you have neutralized half the base into half the acid. Now in your system, you have equal amounts of NH3 and equal amounts of NH4 plus. This means at this point, at exactly this point, your pH is equal to pKa, which is equal to what? 9.2. That's the easiest point. Remember, sometimes you have multiple choice questions. بهدول الquestions في عندكم several answers. You have to find the progression of the pH through these answers. Sometimes when you find pH equal pKa equal 9.2, you don't have to solve the remaining question. We will see this type of questions. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one, at X equals 0. Okay, let's go here. 50, part C, at X equals 0. You have in your system NH3, which is a weak base. How do I find the pH of a weak base? The pH of a weak base is equal to 7 plus half pKa plus half log C. If it's greater or equal, then pKa plus 1. Remember, we always have a problem with C, okay? What you need to ask, عندكم الweak base, did you do anything? Did you change the volume? Did you add anything to change its concentration? No, because right now we are still at the point of 0, X equals 0. So this is 7 plus half 9.2 plus half log 0.1. We didn't change anything in the concentration yet because the system hasn't started yet. So greater or equal 9.2 plus 1, that's 10.2. The value of this, I think it's 11.1, greater or equal than 10.2. Valid. The pH is 11.1. So at X equals 0, the pH is 11.1. Good. At X equals 0.5, Heidi, we already said it, the pH is equal to the pKa, it's equal to 9.2. Think, does it make sense? إنه أنا كنت at 11.2 هلا pH started at 9.2. Does it make sense? When you titrate a base, you are decreasing the basicity. So the pH has to decrease. So yes, it does make sense. أنا بلشت 11.2 وهلا pH بدها تنزل. Okay, at X equals 1. What is X equals 1? What is X equal 1? This is the equivalence point. What do you have at the equivalence point? What is the meaning of the equivalence point? The equivalence point means that the entire base NH3 has been converted to the acid. Equivalence point means that the number of mole of the acid added is equal to the number of mole of the base, and the base is in my system, so now the base has been completely neutralized. What do you have in your system? Only NH4 plus. So at X equals 1, all I have in my system is NH4 plus. How do I find the pH of NH4 plus? pH is equal to half pKa minus half log C. If it's less or equal, then pKa minus 1. We have a problem, which is C. We have a problem, which is basically C. We need to find the new concentration of NH4 plus. Why? Because أول ما بلشنا السيستم كان فيه بس 10 ml. بس خلصت التitration at the equivalence point حطينا another 10 ml. So that means you have a total volume of 20 ml. You change the total volume. According to the conservation of mass, the NH4 plus will equal to 0.1 times 10. This is the initial number of mole of the system, the conserved, but it has to be divided by the total volume, which is 20. And this is equal to 0.05 mole per liter. So now this is the concentration of NH4 plus. When you calculate it, half 9.2 minus half log 0.05 less or equal than 9.2 minus 1, 8.2, you get 5.25 valid. Which one is the pH? 5.25. At x equals 2. What is x equals 2 for a monobase? What is x equals 2? Think about it. أنا بلشت ب NH3. You added H3O plus. You got NH4 plus H2O. أول شيء كنت هون what was I 0.1 times 10. 0.1 times 10 at the equivalence point can 0.1 times 10 أكيد this is in millimole okay. At the equivalence point هيدي limiting وهيدي limiting, they will disappear completely. What you get is 0.1 times 10 millimole of NH4 plus divided by أكيد this is in millimole. To change it into concentration divide by the total volume. ما في second equivalence point هون لأنه this is just one base. It's not a di base. It's not a di base. ما في second equivalence point هون. No. when شايفين second basicity, where did you see another reaction in addition to this reaction? When you add x equals 2, you have double the amount of H3O plus. Double the amount of H3O plus. Instead of adding 10 milliliter, you add 20 milliliter. رجعوا للgiven هيها. At x equals 2, you added 20 ml of the acid. So what happens then? What happens then? كمان initially in millimoles and 0.1 times 10, but now it's 0.1 times 20. Think, من هيدي 20 ml, 10 will neutralize NH3 and another 10 will remain in your solution. This is what happens. At the end, this will be an epsilon value. This will be basically 0.1 times 20 minus 0.1 times 10. So this will be 1 millimole. And you also have 1 millimole here. So now which constituent controls your system in the presence of a weak acid and a strong acid? H3O plus controls the system. What you do is you find the concentration of H3O plus, which is 1 millimole divided by the total volume, which is now 30. 10 for the base, 10 for the acid that neutralized the base, and 10 for the excess acid, which is what? What's 1 divided by 30? What is 1 divided by 30? Yeah. So now the pH is equal 0.03. So now the pH, this أكيد ما بناخد بس number واحد, okay? أبدا, you don't ever take only one number. So the pH, since this is greater or equal than 3.2 times 10 to the power negative 7, بنروح على validity لل strong acid, pH هي minus log H3O plus, which is 1.48. You have to understand what's happening step by step. وهلا بنشوف step by step on a titration curve. خلينا نشوف بالأول بس part D. Part D, give the equation of pH equals F as a function of X for X between 0 and 1. Okay, طيب, good. I don't have any more space هون. لنروح على new page, which is 50 part D. In general, for X equals between 0 and 1, okay, when it is equal to the V of the acid added V of the equivalence. Remember, this is for base, and they differ between a base and an acid. You know that between 0 and 1, basically, you have both species, NH3 and NH4 plus. pH is always equal to pKa plus log base NH3 divided by acid NH4 plus. This is the region when both of them exist at the same time. It's before the equivalence point and after 0. هلا بنشوفها على الكيرف. And this is equal to pKa plus log. فكروا شوي. Before the equivalence point, مين بيكون in access ل NH3. So basically ال NH3 هي CbVb minus limiting, which is CaVa, divided by CaVa. Divide both again by CbVb. CbVb again equal pKa plus log CbVb divided by CbVb. This is 1. CaVa, this is V, divided by CbVb. This is X. Again, CaVa divided by CbVb. This is X. For X between 0 and 1, this is how you can simply find the pH. However, it's for X between 0 and 1 for a monobase. بالتحديد, for a monobase. Compare it to the mono acid and see the difference. D. Let's see E. Draw the shape of the titration curve. مش بس هنرسم الشيب, كمان we will separate it into several areas. Okay, let's see what's happening during the titration curve. Yeah, for the titration curve, it's always pH versus the volume. The volume of what? Mean is your unknown. Sorry, mean is your known. In this case, it's the acid. It's the volume of the acid added. From the pH, you know that you started at a high pH and then let's turn this, and then basically this is what you got. خلينا نشوف كل point هني طلبوها. X equals 0. We know what the pH was at X equals 0, which was 11.2. Then you move to X equals 0.5. خلينا نحدد بالأول وين ال V equivalence. This is, let's say this is my V equivalence. X equals 0.5. At this X, the pH equals pKa. لأنه at 0.5, you're basically V equivalence divided by 2. X equals 1, which is the equivalence point. In the titration of a base with an acid اللي هيدلوا على equivalence point أكيد weak base. اللي هيدلوا على equivalence point is your weak conjugate acid. So at the equivalence point, the pH will be acidic because all you have in your system is NH4 plus. This is the equivalence point. X equals 2. It's 2 VE. You added double the equivalence point, which is 10 plus 10. 10 plus 10. Here we can actually separate. We can say that the first 10 added gave you the equivalence point because it completely neutralized the base present. The second 10 added gave you an excess of the acid H3O+. So this region, هيدي region كلياتها كانت an excess of H3O+. However, this region, هيدي region, you had X between 0 and 1, which is basically pH equals pKa plus log 1 minus X على X. Okay? pH equals pKa plus log على X. And this is your titration curve. X equals 0, X equals 0.5. But حتى لو نسيتوا 0.5, you can simply use it. 1 minus X, 1 minus 0.5 على 0.5. That means 0.5 divided by 0.5. It's 1 log 1, 0, pH equal pKa. So at X equals 0, for bases, the pH is 7 plus half pKa plus half log C. At X equals 1, pH equals half pKa minus half log C. At X equals 2, you have an excess of H3O plus. Simply find the pH is equal to minus log H3O plus, which is basically minus log the H3O plus is CaVa minus CbVb divided by the total volume. Don't forget that. So these are all the ways that you can find the pH of a titration curve. بكل بساطة هيدا هو كله. And this is number 50. Now let's start with number 51. Okay? Now let's start with number 51. Number 51 is the titration of a diacid. Look at the given. Look at it. Consider 4 times 10 to the power negative 3 moles of H2A. You have 2 acidities here. The first acidity and the second acidity. 2 acidities. 2 acidities, it means that you will see 2 equivalence points. The first equivalence point will neutralize أول acidity اللي هي H2A. The second equivalence point will neutralize the second acidity, which is HA minus. So you have 4 times 10 to the power negative 3 mole of concentration, 10 to the power negative 1, and VA. By the way, you can find VA. If you have the moles and you have the concentration, it's very easy to find VA. We progressively add to the diacid a volume VB. It's being titrated by the base, okay, which is 0.1 mole per liter. The first equivalence point is achieved at 5.85 after adding 40 ml. The second, the addition of 60 ml leads to pH equals 8.08. The second equivalence point is achieved after adding 40. في شيء هون that is very clear. If it takes 40 ml to neutralize the first acidity, it takes another 40 to neutralize the second acidity. So 40 ml لأول acidity, then it takes 40 ml to the second acidity. So the first equivalence point هون is 40, the second equivalence point is 80. Understood? خلينا نمشي شوي شوي بهذا السؤال. So let's study the case of a di-acid titration, okay? Very slowly. Let's go. 51. Write the corresponding reactions and give the expression of pH at half equivalence and the equivalences. Okay. This is number 51. Number 51. Part A. أول شيء, let's start with the reactions. أول reaction that will take place is the neutralization of H2A with HO minus. لاحظتوا كتبت 1 HO minus. Okay, so H2A with HO minus will give me HA minus plus H2O. This is the first reaction that will happen, and it corresponds to the first equivalence. The second reaction that will happen is, what is the second acidity? HA minus. It will react with HO minus to give you A2 minus plus H2O. This is the second reaction that will take place in the system, and it is responsible for the second equivalence point. Now let's separate the system into هيدول البوينتس اللي هن طلبوهم, which are basically half equivalences and equivalences, and I need to also add the zero. Okay, I also need to add the zero. So let's start with the first one. What happens when I add 0 ml? What do I have in my system when I have 0 ml? Okay, 0 ml. What I have is the acid H2A. Good. Do you all remember how to find the pH of this acid? This is a diacid. It has pKa1, pKa2. تطلع على pKa's أو kA's. If the difference between pKa is greater or equal to 2, then neglect the second acidity only in the calculation of initial pH. Neglect the second acidity, will pH is half pKa 1. Why 1? لأنه I neglected the second, minus half log C. Normally, especially in titration, it is very important to be able to neglect the second to find the pH. So yes, normally pKa بتكون, you have a difference of at least 2. Again, lesser equal, then pKa 1 minus 1. V equals 0. طيب خلينا نروح على الأسهل, which is V equivalence. خلينا نترك الhalf equivalence هون, نشتغل بالV equivalence. They said that the V equivalence is 40 ml. وهيدي the first equivalence point. For the first equivalent point, طلعوا على الreaction. The first equivalence point, right here, tells you that H2A has been completely neutralized, and what you have in your solution is predominantly HA minus. So what I have in my solution is predominantly HA minus. How can I find the pH of HA minus? It's an ampholyte. Then if all you have in your solution is HA minus, the pH is equal to half pKa1 plus pKa2. Very easy. Very easy. Okay, it's very easy. Now let's go to the second easiest point, which is the second equivalence point, which is the second equivalence point اللي هي 2VE. 2VE, it means you have added double the equivalence volume, which is 80 ml. This is the second equivalence point. رجعوا للreaction يلي فوق. What does it mean when I say it's the second equivalence point? Second equivalence point يعني you are in the second reaction. You have completely neutralized HA minus, and now all you have in your solution is basically A2 minus. This is what you have in your solution. What is A2 minus? What is A2 minus? It's a weak base. It's a weak dye base. Again, neglect the difference in PA and pKa, then pH equals 7 plus half. Since A2 minus belongs to the second couple, يلي مضيع بالcouples هيدا أول couple, and this is the second couple. Since A2 minus belongs to the second couple, have pKa2 plus half log C. Again, if it's greater or equal than pKa2 plus 1. Remember, in هون you have only one problem. Find the real concentration of C اللي هي conservation of mass. خدوا number of mole الأساسي اللي بلشتوا فيه of H2A and divided by the total volume. This is your new C. What is the total volume? 40 من الأسيد and 80 from the titration. كلهم هنحلهم, don't worry. Now let's go to something even easier. Between 0 and 40, you have volume equals 20 ml. 20 ml, which is the equivalence 1 divided by 2. خلينا نحط دغري equivalence divided by 2 لأنه حطيناهم as E. At this point, VE over 2, which is the first half equivalence. من اسمه, the first half equivalence. It means that you are in the first reaction and at the half equivalence point. Half equivalence, it means that you have acid equal to the base. Nil first reaction. It means at this point, H2A is equal to HA minus. Okay, then what is your pH? بكل بساطة pKa1 لأنه it's Henderson-Hasselbalch. Now let's actually look at the second half equivalence. What is the second half equivalence? It is the half equivalence that belongs to the second reaction. Half equivalence, it means عندكم the same amount of the acid and the base. A second half equivalence, his second reaction, it means you have the same amounts of the acid HA minus and the same amount of the base A2 minus. What is the value of the second equivalence? If بتكون 40 ml to neutralize the first acidity, نصها 20. بتكون another 40 to neutralize the second acidity. But remember something, إنه ما بترجعوا بالسكيل للزيرو. يعني أنا already استخدمت من الزيرو لل40 لأول acidity. هلا I have to use 40 to 80 for the second acidity. نص ال40 وال80 is 60. So the volume of the second half equivalence بقول عنه 3E over 2 لأنه it's basically 40 plus half is 60 ml. And at this point, the pH is equal to pKa of the couple that you have here, the couple that you see here, which is pKa2. And this is how you divide the خليني أقول the points in your diacid. 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. وكده هلا هنرجع نعملهم calculation أكيد ونحطهم على الكيرف. Okay, let's see what part B is. خلينا نشوف part B. In part B, determine the value of the acidity constants Ka1 and Ka2. They did not give us Ka1 and Ka2 actually, but they want this value. Okay, خلينا نطلع الجيفن. What pH did they give? لأن أنا بالنهاية I need to use pH to find pKa. So theoretically, if I have the pH at the first half equivalence, هيدي ال pKa1. If I have the pH at the second half equivalence, this is pKa2. Now look at your given. Which pH did they give you? The addition of 60 ml leads to a pH of 8.8. 60 is the second half equivalence point. So this is your pKa2. This is your pKa2. So بروح أنا لبارت B or C, part B. At V equals 60 ml, or I know إنه this is the second half equivalence. 3VE over 2, VE هي 40 times 3 divided by 2 is 60. At this point, the pH is equal to pKa2, and they gave me the pH to be 8.08. This is my pKa2. من ال pKa2 أكيد I can find the Ka2, which is 10 to the negative 8.08. There is one more given in pH, one more given عطونية, which is the pH at equivalence point at VE, which is 40 ml. You know that this is the equivalence point. They told me that the pH is 5.85. طيب اطلعوا على ال V equivalence. What is the relationship that you have? At the V equivalence, you only have HA minus, which is an ampholyte. So at this pH, it's equal to have pKa1 plus pKa2. You already found that pKa2 is 8.08. And this is equal to 5.85. It is now easy to find pKa1, which is basically 5.85 times 2 minus 8.08, 3.62. Then Ka1 is 10 to the negative 3.62. That's it. بكل بساطة. If you know these points, you can solve all diacidic titration curves. So I found the pKa1 and pKa2. Good. What else do they want? Calculate the pH at the second equivalence. Again, this is part C. At the second equivalence, اللي هو 2VE, which is 80 ml, what do you have? A2 minus exists in your solution. How can I find the pH? 7 plus, again, half pKa2 plus half log C. If it's greater or equal, then pKa2 plus 1. What's your problem? C. Okay, C is your problem. How can I find the real concentration of A2 minus? A2 minus in number of mole بتتساوي الأساسية اللي هي H2A. Conservation of mass. In number of mole it has to be equal to the initial number of mole لأنه كل ال H2A is converted into A2 minus. So it is equal to the number of mole of A2 minus divided by the total volume. هلا انتبهوا على something very small. Normally ما بيعطوكم the number of mole of A2 minus, but they do give you its concentration and its volume. Okay? Sorry, مش ال A2 minus. اللي هي number of mole of H2A according to the conservation of mass divided by V total. مثل ما قلت normally ما بيعطوكم the number of mole of H2A, they just give you its concentration and its volume. وانتوا بتعرفوا the number of mole هي CV. But in this case they did give you the number of mole. Okay, they did tell you that the number of mole of H2A is 4 times 10 to the power negative 3. And if you don't know it, you can calculate it. C ضرب V, which is equal to 40. Okay, so equal to, how much was it? 4 times 10 to the negative 3 divided by, what is the total volume? 40 for the acid and 80 was added during titration, which is equal to 0.0334 molar. This is C now. خليني أنا بس هيدولي لتحت. This is now C. So the pH is equal to 7 plus half pKa2. What is pKa2? 8.08 plus half log 0.0334. Okay, greater than pKa2 plus 1. Then pKa2 plus 1, 9.08. And this is basically 10.30 greater than 9.08, valid. So this is your pH. And that's it. This is 51. Okay, we're gonna stop the recording. اللي عنده أي سؤال يحط لي على الشات قبل ما نبلش بالnext exercise.